Hey, Gleb here. Welcome to yet another episode from the Creating Stylized Art series by Manu Järvinen and Creative Shrimp team. Let's talk about distribution of shapes. First of all, I'd like to encourage you to have a look at this selection of artworks by Manu Järvinen, and I have also included one by Paul Chambers, this amazing stylized trunk. You can check more of the Paul's works at his website, paulchambers.com. So I claim that just by looking at these artworks, we can immediately see that they share something in common. We can say that they share some properties of style, but also it goes a little bit deeper than that. They also share the way in which the big, medium and small shapes are distributed, and also the way in which the negative space is used. There is some underlying theory going on behind the scenes of how those shapes interact with each other, how they are distributed on the canvas and within the figure, how the negative space is used. But what matters for us, let's talk about how to utilize those principles of shape distribution to achieve the most visually appealing results. Well, it's necessary to mention that it may well be that these artistic decisions may not have been consciously managed, but what really matters for us is that if we look at an image and feel it's not working on some level, then being able to use a theory we're going to explore here consciously can often help us to scratch that little itch in the back of our minds. Originally, this theory was proposed by Neil Blevins in one of the posts on his website. Let's just map those principles onto creating stylized 3D art. Let's use this Johnny Robo that Manu kindly gave to us as an example. The first thing that I would like to point out is how the main figure stands out from the background. The background is relatively empty. It is what is called negative space. And on the other hand, all the details, all the separation of shapes, the collage of big, medium and small shapes is situated in the middle of the image where the robot character is. All the fun details are scattered right there, but first let's focus on the big shapes. I'm going to enable the outline of the biggest shape, which is the silhouette of the character. So here we have it roughly outlined in the reddish color. It's how we approximately would see it if we squinted our eyes. It's this kind of a rough silhouette, our big or primary shape. Two things worth mentioning. First one is we can still tell it's a robo, or at least some mechanical bipedal thingy. The second one is that this shape is relatively easy on the eyes. It doesn't take long to process, right? It's this kind of a shape that forms a big ink blot, easy to grasp, just by having a brief look at the image. It's very smooth, cute, harmless, you name it. And yet we can tell it's a robo. So establishing an easily readable primary shape is a great first step towards creating a visually appealing image. But once again, what makes the figure stand out and what makes it readable is relatively empty space surrounding it. Sometimes it's also called a negative space, as opposed to the, positive space occupied by the figure. It doesn't necessarily have to be absolutely empty, like an open space, but it really helps to keep it toned down. And then, on the contrast, you start adding details to the figure, keeping in mind a little bit cartoonish style that we have chosen, presumably. So the blue here represents the medium shapes or the secondary shapes. Or we can say that we have started to add details here. Notice how Manu strategically adds details confined to the main silhouette, the big shape of a robo. It's because it's where it really matters. Breaking down the big shapes into medium here really allows to focus the interest there. But also notice that not everything is broken down into these secondary shapes. There is some kind of an empty space or negative space still left. Somehow it's gravely important to have the right balance between the occupied and unoccupied parts of the space of the image, or of the model if we talk 3D. And on a side note, each one of the secondary shapes is still very easy on the eyes in terms of its silhouette, its blobbiness. Blobbiness? in terms of how it follows the visual language of shapes that we have established by introducing the main shape first, then breaking it down. We still maintain some kind of visual language. And not only this, but also we try to maintain the ratio between big and medium, and for that matter, medium and small. There is no point in giving the exact ratios, but for example, the medium shape turns out in this case to be approximately 1/5 of the big one. Oh, okay, forget it. That's not important. What is important is that we try to maintain this ratio throughout the detailing process. Alright, so let's say we have split the big silhouette into the set of medium shapes. We maintained a little bit of negative space to make it visually appealing. We also keep in mind that our style is a little bit generalized, so we keep the silhouettes of these secondary shapes also very simple. So what's next? Next is the fun stuff, details. Let's turn them on. The yellow here will represent the tertiary shapes or details, obviously, and yet the first thing that we can notice is that even though we have scattered the details, they occupy a relatively small portion of the image, or more precisely, a small portion of the space already occupied by figure or by the primary shape. And even the blue secondary shapes, which purpose was to break down the primary one, now serve as a backdrop for the details. See, every step of the way we try to maintain the ratio of the busy space compared to the resting space, while making sure that we have enough resting space, because that's important. So if you take just one thing away from this tutorial, let it be this one. Have enough negative space in your image and drink more coffee. Well, that's technically two things. Anyway. Alright, one thing that we haven't talked about yet is the proportions. Why the details are this size? Why aren't they a little bit smaller or much bigger than that? It's a tricky question, basically. Very tricky. When we split the big shapes into medium and medium into small, we do it according to some proportion that we establish usually intuitively. Let's go back a step and have a look at the compilation of those images of Manu, which have a certain proportion established. We can clearly see it just by looking at them. Let's say it's this kind of relationship between big, medium and small. A certain proportion going on. These images show exactly the same proportion, more or less, while this one by Paul Chambers is a little bit different, right? It's also an awesome render, but it's different in terms of the relationship between big, medium and small shapes. It's something like that. The small one is not as small as it was in Manu's renders. Say, if we compare the entire perimeter of the big shape, which is the trunk, to the detail over there, we will notice that the scale of the details was a little bit exaggerated compared to the style that Manu have chosen. It's totally a matter of personal preference, a matter of style. There is no right or wrong way to determine proportions. Leonardo da Vinci would disagree with us here, probably. Anyway, these things are usually determined intuitively, on the fly, and the more realistic is the style, the more range it shows between the biggest of the shapes and the smallest. But yeah, ultimately it boils down to the personal preference. What is important is to keep this proportion throughout. But anyway, the most important consideration would be to scatter these details in clumps and leave some breathing room for them by giving enough negative space. The simple mantra, 20% of details and 80% of empty space, or Manu would say 70-30, we argue about that, but anyways, having enough empty space is equally important as where to place the details. Alright, let's have a look at some other examples to show the same theory in action. This hoodie is slightly more simplified compared to the Robo. Well, roughly in the same spot, but slightly more simplified. The clear primary shape surrounded by empty space. The primary one is broken down into some secondary shapes, while leaving enough room for them to breathe. And then we see the fine accents represented in yellow here, which occupy a relatively small portion of the space. Once again, pay attention to the megaparsecs of the empty space that's around everything on every level, including the backdrop, and how important it is to make it pop and to make it readable and to just make it look appealing, I guess. There's also a specific ratio going on, we have talked about that. The figures are not important, there is no reason to establish some math here. And yet I always try to do that for some reason, it's useless. Why do I do that? You will have to find your own golden mean for your works. It's totally your style. Right, and here we have the pole chamber's trunk once again. Just to show how the proportion is different, I guess. Different, but yet the same distribution of shapes. So the proportions isn't a universal thing, while I claim the distribution of shapes kind of is. When you nail down the distribution, you can play with any combination of relative sizes of the shapes. Just make sure that the overall thing isn't super crowded, and it will be practically impossible to mangle it. Let's quickly sum up what we have discussed in this video from the Creating Stylized Art video course. So we have discussed the distribution of shapes and how it can help to shape the most visually striking image, or rather cute looking, if we talk about the stylized art. Basically, it often boils down to the distribution of shapes and to having enough negative space in your image on all levels. It all starts with establishing the big primary shape that is hopefully easily readable, so you can tell that it's a robot, it's a car, it's a piece of cloth. And even at this stage, it's useful to tone down the backdrop, to make it less contrasty, to make sure it doesn't draw any extra attention from the main figure. And then it's a matter of carefully and slowly introducing the secondary shapes, while keeping the 80 to 20 ratio of free and occupied space. And after that, even smaller details, and usually it stops here on 3 levels of shapes of different sizes. And on a side note, what about the realistic renderers like this one? Is it any different in terms of shape distribution? Well, it's different in terms of levels of details and overall proportions, not much difference in terms of distribution of those shapes. It just usually has more, well, levels. For example, let's take this part. In the non-photorealistic rendering context, it would mean that after splitting the big shape into those blue secondary shapes, the end of the road would be to just throw in a couple of details here and there and call it a day. It's slightly different when it comes to more realistic styles that usually simulate the reality, and reality is infinitely complex, unlike our very controlled, artistically driven, stylized art. So it can have the 4th, the 5th, the 6th level of details, going deeper and deeper. You can subdivide it as many times as you would like for the ultimate Bulgarov-style realism when we talk about robots. Yet it is as important as in the case of the stylized art that you follow the same rules of distribution of those things, that you clump the details and just leave enough space to maintain the overall structure, the negative space, I mean. The only tangible difference is the number of those subdivisions and the range of sizes between the biggest and the smallest parts, for that matter. This robo is, by the way, from the HUD Surface Modeling video course that you can also find on Creative Shrimp website. Ta-da! Thank you for watching. That was Gleb Alexandrov for CreativeShrimp.com. You were watching the Creating Stylized 3D Art in Blender course by Manu Järvinen, 80 Burrows, and me, Gleb Alexandrov. If you want to share your work-in-progress results with us, feel free to find us on Twitter. That would be much appreciated. Thank you.